So again, so it's more about context, but context at a different level. There are places where she weaves in a bit of theory. She's got some art talking about multiculturalism as philosophy in time. She uses a lot of art in the thesis, but she doesn't kind of indicate that. So I'm now on page 19. I was saying before that she's hinting at the kind of a research gap that she's addressing. Here it's spelled out a little bit more. But again, she doesn't do it in the formulaic fashion that says the research gap I'm addressing this. What she does is, having talked about how Western Sydney is other, what she does is to suggest there's another way of thinking about this. And that's her way of saying, I'm doing what other people want to do. There's a gap here, I'm addressing it. And she gives a couple of examples about how people in Western Sydney don't see their life in the way that's typically represented in popular discourse or in academic discussions. So she's opening up the kind of space that her thesis is moving into. Then she moves into higher education in Western Sydney. And so what she's doing here is bringing layers of context together. So if you think about what she's talked about so far, she had a very specific discussion about the site, Rainbrook, in the schools in the area. She had a larger discussion about Western Sydney. She had a discussion about the history of education. And so she's actually putting together in this next section for another layer of context. Then, so there are little bits of theory that are woven along the way. But on page 21, she does this thing where she says about 2/3 of the way down, one of my participants, Bernadette, described the university as the latter. Bernadette, as I elaborated in chapter 4, has struggled to read by life. Is it okay to introduce the participants in the introduction of your thesis?
That was unusual. Yeah, it was unusual, for sure.
It's one of the rules she breaks. Okay, you're not supposed to talk about your data until you're ready to talk about your data. Okay, and she's not doing it in a way where she's talking about everybody. She's using Bernadette as an illustrative example about some of the issues that she wants to raise about conflict. So she's broken a kind of a convention. Maybe rule is too strong a word, but she's done something that you're supposed to be told not to do. And that has to be handled really well. If it's handled poorly, you get slapped. It's like supervisor. Okay, so so she uses Bernadette to kind of put together some of the things about aspiration, employment, and education. Then she widens out to talk more broadly about the participants, okay, but it's not the sample section, which we get later on. So again, she kind of does this weird thing. She talks about something that she's actually going to talk about later on, but it doesn't seem to jar. And then on page 22, again, there are woven in here particular kinds of claims, terms that are crucial to her arguments later on. So the discussion of gratitude, for example, is actually something that she picks up in the relation to gratitude. Okay, and then we have the methodology section. So she's kind of started talking about aspects of the methodology, and then we have a methodology. So again, kind of think what's going on here, but it doesn't seem to kind of jar. And it's, at this point, it kind of goes fairly conventional. She has a simple listing of the research questions. Okay. And some people actually stop at putting the research questions in introductions or turn them into more discursive plans. Others kind of like to put in there to think they're dealing with it. She has a very simple account of their methods. Okay. And then what she starts to do is to move into methodological reflection. She starts to think about the methodology and link it to kind of theoretical issues. She uses moments. She uses the reflection, the methodological reflection, to talk about how she can change her methodology at various points because she realizes what she's doing is wrong. And they become it becomes a different kind of thing with just the account of the methodology. most people would actually, if they change the methodology or change the questions, they won't tell you. You know, you hide that. So what you present at the end, you pretend it's what you started. You know, you should make sense. Sometimes it's changed.
Can I just discuss that later because that's a short one.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's a good one. And in that, so in the section of recruitment, page 24, she also again has a methodological reflection. So she starts with conventional account, then she has a methodological reflection, which actually feeds into analytical imperative to avoid binaries and ideological assumptions. So the discussion of recruitment is actually a deeper argument about we have to be careful about sorting people into categories for sophisticated ways, because that will actually shape your analysis if you're not careful. And then, again, one of her weird maneuvers, at the bottom of page 24, she gives you these little one-line summaries of the chapters before we get to the chapter summaries. In the section on recruitment. So at no point you read through it and think, oh, that's a mistake. So each little shift that she makes has a logic to it. The discussion is here for a reason. Again, there's page 25, again, there's methodological reflection and change or correction. She changes things. So a sample, again, starts off as kind of a conventional account. So she's doing a lot of formula things. Data production. So she put data production and positionality together, which is kind of wrong. Most people will have a thing about data production and data analysis, and then come back to research and positionality. But again, for her, they're linked. And they're linked partly because she's in the microcosm that she's talking about. And then she goes on to elaborate the position in relationship to the kind of methodological issue. And she brings in another participant, Jacqueline, on page 28, to illustrate a particular kind of issue. So she's grappling here with the fact that actually my history was very similar to theirs, but it's different. And so she also kind of finds herself making the mistake of assuming that we are the same. And that has consequences for the research.
She does that at several points about the time when she's speaking to the participant and she shares her experience and the participant really reacts in like it sort of shuts down the conversation in the way that it's happening, and she's cautious of that. And
it's nice how she reflects on it
exactly
as a researcher,
Oh,
and
okay.
also how personal it becomes, and then it kind of makes you realize as someone that's doing a thesis that it's hard to separate yourself from your research completely.
But
To catch yourself.
that's usually a reflection that takes place in the conclusion of the thesis.
Right.
She's doing the introduction.
But it works.
So my theory is that what she's actually doing, she's kind of the foreground of the manufactured nature of the production of data. So research is not about finding the truth about people's lives. It's about producing data in very specific circumstances that aren't true or reality. So again, she's kind of hinting at that without kind of whacking over the head with it. And then okay, so before I talk about the very last section, where are you going to put your methodology? For some of you, really hard question. Obviously,
second chapter.
Yeah, you haven't made up your mind yet, Chris?
I think I'll put it in the second chapter after.
So one of the choices that we have to make is what do we do with methodology? Okay? It's kind of always going to be a short chapter unless you're doing something really unusual. So for some people, it feels a bit odd to have a short methodology chapter. For some people, it feels a bit boring just to talk about methodology. And so she's made a choice not to put it as a standalone chapter, but to weave it into the introduction as a way of setting up some of the issues. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I have one more question, because when you go the introduction, for my understanding, I think we should literature view after the introduction. Otherwise, you put the methodology after the introduction, I think it's beautiful.
Well, again, you have to think through the logic. So it's not a formula. It's not you do this, then you do that, then you do that.
Yeah.
It's what is the flow of things that the thesis needs to get its work done.
But when you do literature view, you find the problem. You find some kind of thing which is the problem there. So then you put up your methodology. This is the problem. I'm thinking, yes, this is my way to fix this problem.
So I would typically say the next chapter would be a literature review.
Yeah.
Okay, this is what the field says.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm using bits of the field to identify a series of problems that I'm going to deal with. So this is the research problem that comes out of the field.
Yeah.
And then you have a methodology chapter, which is the way you're going to answer the questions that you've asked and the basis of the gap at the end of that. So there's a logic to it, but she doesn't follow that.
Why?
Well, you tell me. Do you want me to open a bit more?
Yeah. It's time. It's time.
Bruce,
So to answer that why, Greg, there could be various reasons. It's her writing style. She's got a certain style, a certain way of doing things. She likes to pique interest in a different, engaging way. She knows that the audience isn't just going to be her panel; it's going to be others. Like as a layperson here reading this, I now want to read the rest of it. Right? It's a really good teaser. So whatever she did, her why is very much to engage us. But I mean, how do you develop that? And what was just mentioned now about the order to be an intro lit review methodology, that's what us as MRA students actually have come in to have a structure to then, if we decide to go PhD, the expectation is that. So what you're saying right now to us and what you're showing us is actually really important, because it shows that you can actually have a way of doing things without being too conventional.
So my point is this: that formulas are okay as a thinking device.
Mm-hmm.
They shouldn't be a requirement that you have to fill in like an online format devices.
Yeah.
It should be a device that, oh, I see why I have to do this and do this and do this. But oh, wait a minute, what if I want to do this? Okay. And the structure of the thesis is hard enough to kind of get your head around. And a few will know the example I've told many times in the student I had some years ago with a supervisor with somebody else, and there was one particular section of his thesis that we couldn't work out where it fit. And the other supervisor and I had a stand-up argument about because we just disagreed. And the students sat there kind of what was going on. And we actually put it in 3 different places in the thesis. And all of them came with advantages and disadvantages. So structure is not an obvious logic. But there are logics from going from the literature review to the research, except.
Yeah. So where should put the literature review? Because we have one.
So you want me to be the oracle? So the literature review.
No, what's the
What's first in Alex?
Yes.
It's the next chapter. Next chapter. It's the next chapter. Yes, it's the next chapter. And then
Then it's okay. So-
so
Okay, sorry, because she put introduction, but the introduction already including the methodology already. Then she put the literature review.
Yeah.
After the literature review, what is the third section?
then she has a bit more of a background chapter. Very cool. it doesn't matter. I'm not going to talk about the whole piece.
So.
Maybe we should actually have, I've invited Alex in to talk about exhibition. So, back to the introduction. So you have to make a choice. Most people choose to have a separate methodology chapter for obvious reasons. It's easy.
Yeah.
But there are always choices to be made.
And you could also do both, right? Like for a research, like perhaps mine, which is actually research, like half of, or more than half of the thesis would be about methodology because it's a reflection on the work that you're also doing. So then it becomes crucial that you introduce what you're doing in the introduction as you're working with methodology, and then have a separate chapter on it as well.
Yeah. So typically, people will have a paragraph that says, I did this by interviewing 25 people from this particular area and asked questions about blah, blah, blah. And then you move on to the rest of it. And so you have it. So in the introduction, it's kind of like an overture. So it's got bits of everything that are flagged. The rest of the piece is flagged. And then you come back to the detail as well. That's conventional. She's not quite doing it. So the last point that I want to ask before I can make a few more summary points is the last section of the introduction is called these arguments. So normally what people do in the format is chapter summaries.
Yeah, yeah.
So why is she now shifting? Why is she changing the language here?
Tell us. You tell us.
No, it's a question.
I'm curious. What was your question?
Why is it thesis arguments that I said to, not chapter summaries? So normally somebody would say, they get to their end of their bit and say, okay, in the next chapter I do this, in the chapter after that I do this, in the third chapter I do this.
So is it safe to say that each chapter is addressing each claim that she's already mentioned in her intro, and then obviously she delves into each of that more and more in each chapter? So it's each argument, it's therefore?
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the things that people grapple with is when I do my little summaries of chapters, am I just kind of looking at telling people what I'm exploring, or should I tell people what I'm arguing? Okay. And this has to be handled really carefully, because if you just say what you're arguing, then you're presenting your conclusions before it's all done. So it has to be handled very skillfully. What she's done is to kind of link it to her the woven theoretical themes and ideas that she's got throughout the introduction. So by the time you get to the thesis argument summary, it doesn't feel like it's a radically different thing. I don't think. But I'll say this about Alex, is that, so one of the things that we really struggle with here, which is a very common topic, is, so what are you actually arguing? So we've got lots of the ethnographic detail, lots of exploration of themes, but what is it you're not saying? So in fact, this last section is kind of like the dress to a supervisor. So, okay, you want me to spell it out? I'm going to spell it out. And so many postgrads are tentative about their voice when they write the thesis. They don't know how much they can present as what they want to say. Again, something that might be covered by demonstrator on. But it's an interesting problem, how much of what I want to argue should be flagged here.
Question. Firstly, yes, you're right. I've been told many times to use my active voice, and I still struggle with that because I've been conditioned not to previously. The second thing is, in terms of this, like the thesis arguments and even the structure of this intro, this would have been a negotiation between her and yourselves. You're putting a lot of the, I guess, credit to what she was choosing to do and how she was choosing to do this. How much of that was negotiated between her and the panel?
A lot, as it always is. She's not clear in this case.
Yeah,
In fact, I happened to come across the first feedback that she got on the first version of the introduction. We were pretty tough.
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah.
And she responded to that, as you all will have to do. Okay, because as I keep saying, you don't write a thesis every other day, so you have no idea what you're doing until you do. I'm actually going to, did you want to kind of quickly raise a question or leave to the end?
Well, I'm not sure. Yes, can I raise it and then we can sort of think about it.
Okay.
For sure.
So it's to do with like so my research has been a general process of discovery. So it's nothing about just the listening exercise where you I'm doing this and here's how I've done it. So it's, the focus has changed a bit as so what I've found is that my secondary questions or my sub questions have become more important than my primary questions. So, and then when I go to write the introduction, how do I frame that? And because my initial rationale for the research seems a little bit outdated. So, yeah, I've written an introduction, but I've written 2 versions, but I haven't quite grappled with this. I'm just not quite sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't find it because I feel it's okay. It's, it's massive. So it's like over 4 years, I think it's changed, I think.
Yeah.
So this is my mini dilemma.
If they haven't changed, I'd be very, very worried.
Yeah, so I found it. So it was looking quite primarily at interpretation of heritage to begin with, and now I'm looking more at visitor narratives and in the context of separate poems. So there's been I'm still looking at the interpretation, but there's more of this shift onto the underlying discourses of the narratives. So I don't think that what I've originally written is in my rationale from the research is now adequate. So yeah, how would you respond to that?
So my response would be, I'd write it up
Yeah.
as it happened.
Well, that's what I'm trying.
So do it as a journey.
I've tried to do that. I started here, but then I sort of got feedback that I wasn't sufficiently clear. I wasn't really clear enough interpretation of why I'm doing this and what it's about. So I sort of left it. Now I've left it to come back to it.
Yeah, and that's okay. Okay, because as I just said with Alex's introduction, this is the 4th version.
Yeah.
And she did 9 versions of that, which is another issue. But so that where I want to kind of spend the last 20 minutes or so is to think about that.
Sorry, 9 versions of an abstract.
Okay, and there's a reason for that. Okay, so when should I write an introduction? Okay, so I can either quote Lewis Carroll at you, which is you start at you begin at the beginning and you keep going until you get to the end, then you stop. Okay, so when I was a student, the logic was you write the thesis from the beginning to the end. Okay? Nowadays, most people don't do that. It's more likely to say, write up your empirical stuff. Okay, and then come back to the introduction. Because you've already done something like a COC, which kind of works as a provisional introduction. This is what I'm going to do. And then you have to do your research and then start lining it up, and then you come back to the introduction. Some people disagree with that, but to me, that's kind of a logical thing to do. For other people, they say, no, I have to go work in my theoretical framework before I think about the group. So there are choices, again, that have to be made that will be logical in situ about the context you're writing in, not a predetermined format. But the point I want to make is this. That question is actually linked to a bunch of other questions or issues. So we think of an introduction as a structuring device for the reader. Okay, we're writing it so the reader can read the thesis and know where we're going. But that's the end point. So to come back to your issue, what you might end up with might actually be something from an examiner that gets rid of the dirty bits, the messy bits, but you might keep them in there, okay, because it tells you something about the process. But that's a choice. But in the first instance, you want the messy version that kind of tries to do some things, because it's always going to be unfinished. So a couple of ideas I think you should think about is that it's for some people writing an introduction at the beginning, even if it's like a 1,500 word, 2,000 word introduction, is useful because it's an orientating thing. It's a cover plan. An introduction is another way of writing a plan. Okay, I've done the plan, but it still doesn't quite gel. I might just try and write a little introduction to see what the plan hangs together. So introductions in the process, not the final product. Writing introductions is part of the process of conditionally scaffolded. Okay? But it is that because it's a way of developing your argument. So even if you write up your empirical chapters, you kind of still don't know what you're arguing. So I want to suggest it's a kind of a dialogue between bits and pieces as you kind of work towards the argument. And so I actually want to think about the introduction as a kind of a pedagogical device. It's not a contract, okay, but it's a way of learning about what you're doing with things. So we kind of think of the research is the learning thing, and the writing is the writing thing. And in fact, writing is learning. Now I've got I recently read quite a few from Martin Amis, the English novelist. Yeah, I'm not suggesting you read this book. It's a bit infuriating, but he does have this line, which is nice, which is that writing a novel is a learning experience. You kind of write it, then you flip it over and you start at the beginning, and suddenly you realize you don't know much stuff, and you don't work through bits you don't know. So it's a bit like a thesis. Okay? So writing a thesis is a learning process. It's learning about the writing, it's learning about how to make arguments, how to analyze data, and how to put things together. And you can't know that before you start. So you have to learn it through the process, even if you're a skilled writer. Okay, so that's why I kind of want to talk about introduction as a thinking or a pedagogical process. You're actually using to think through problems, not just prepare the final text for the thesis. So, sorry, it's another one of my favourite quotes from Sir Mills, the ancient sociologist, and basically saying, you don't just plan at the beginning, and then you do what you do. You've actually got to keep planning and revising the plans and revising the revisions of the plans. And a thesis is a bit like that, actually. That's why you keep revising and rewriting. Okay? And simply because, so the introduction as a process, not the final document, is a thinking device. Thinking is a struggle for order and comprehensiveness.
You should just put the full stop after struggle.
But, well, it's not just you also just struggles. But, so you know this line, this kind of view that the introduction is the last thing you finish. You probably heard supervisors say that. It's kind of truism there. And it's kind of right because, in a sense, you don't know what you're going to introduce until you've written the thing that you introduce. So,
like you always write the preface to the book, the last.
Yes, so you kind of write recently. Actually, that kind of 2 pages I had on that doesn't work anymore. To get rid of that, what I really need is a kind of a discussion of this. So, but what I want to say is not just you finish writing the thesis and you go back and rewrite the introduction. You've actually got to do this kind of interactive thing. Okay, and so the whole thesis is the whole thesis is this constant interaction between the bits and pieces. Okay, so one of the things that your supervisor will do when they read your thesis is say, okay, this bit in chapter 6, that seems to contradict the bit in chapter 3, and you haven't seen it. And you can't possibly see it because it requires a particular kind of reading skill that you are developing. So that's why your supervisors are there to help you read your own work and see it. So there are bits here and bits here that contradict each other, bits here and bits here that actually complement each other really well, and you still haven't seen it. So, and that's all through the thesis. But the introduction, of course, is particularly important because, like the conclusion, it's got to have a cohesion to it. It's got to bring things together before we see them. Okay? So that's why you get to this tedious in your last year you do the thesis, where the supervisor says, no, I want the next version. You'll do this, and so on, the next version. Okay? It's tedious, but it's the craft of writing. And it's writing something, even if you're a skilled writer, it's writing in a way that you've never written before. So that's why we're kind of doing it.
I'd just like to share this in the quote, but I'd like to use in my introduction to try and explain this. It's from Foucault, actually. He says, I'm not perceived by linear deduction, but rather by concentric circles, moving sometimes towards the outer and sometimes towards the inner ones.
I also have a favourite quote, which is James Joyce, okay, who, when asked how his latest novel was, I can't remember what it was used, I think this one. He says, I finished writing it, I'm just going to work out which order the words in. Okay. And there's a truth to that. That, you know, in your last year, you might have 8,000 words, but it's not a thesis. And so the bits of the thesis For an Everest, you might have 20,000.
So, yes, thank you. A quarter.
So you've got to kind of move into that next stage where you actually see how the bits fit in relationship to each other. And the introduction is really crucial for course setting up that fitting together. Okay. My last slide. Oh yeah. Comments, insights.
We're gonna have questions at the end as well. Right at the end.
I'm sure that's will allow you asking the question.
Will you still be here as well, Greg?
Yeah, so let's set aside however long, 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Have a break.
So, have a break in between. Yeah.
So I will you
No.
Dennis can write another thesis.
Yeah.
In between.
got me thinking actually about the flexibility of writing now on computers. You only have to go back to the 1970s, which basically a long time ago, where people were writing theses on typewriters. Right. You have no option to, the only way you can go back, the only way you can reorder things is to do what used to be called a cut and paste. But, you know, clearly if you start doing that very much, the text remains the same. You can't just drop pieces of text onto a page like that. So what we're doing now is, in terms of human history, it's actually quite radical. The way we, the entire work, you know, in its entirety becomes incredibly fluid until, you know, you finally stop. It's fluid and that can make connections all the way through it, and as you're going along. It's quite amazing. And
Yeah. So I when I wrote my business, I wrote it out by hand, and then started to type it on a typewriter. And I don't have typing skills, so I got my sister and my mother-in-law to type up objects, like the general division of labor.
That's awesome.
And then they actually trained as secretaries, so they actually type.
Wow.
And then I got a laptop like in the last.
How long was your thesis duration?
How long did it take to do?
Yeah,
A very long time, like unbelievably long.
yeah, that's what.
So I had a really long candidature.
Is usually
So how long are you
7
talking?
years or-
So I took about 7 or 8 years to do my
Yeah.
business. But I worked full time actually at the time. But yeah, the typing things. First time I used an electronic typewriter for a regulation. You could actually fiddle with wires.
yeah, that's a sort of transition into word processing.
Yes.
And then they invented electricity and motor car and all those kinds of things. And we really got with it.
Okay. All right. That's the joke, right?
Same, I think I've also, like the last thesis that I wrote for the masters, which was about 65,000, so it was actually a long thesis, but like I wrote more than half of it longhand because I always felt that the relationship between writing by hand and thinking happened much easier than typing. So it has taken a bit of time to actually be able to type and think and go between, you know, things
So-
together. So
So I agree with that. For a whole generation. Megan and I have actually written on how handwriting allows thinking in a way that typing doesn't.
yeah,
Mm.
exactly.
And it's not about materiality of making letters and words. It's on a computer, everything is just touch the button.
Yeah.
There's no differentiation.
Even
So
like
it's making-
occasional
making-
doodling and whatever, like however you write and then you're thinking and you're doodling and you're writing, coming back to writing. So all that process gets lost when you're typing.
So the bottom line is to re-emphasize writing as a kind of craft.
Yeah.
And legacy And often these process is necessarily slow. So at the end, it's not about producing words, it's about producing text. Where you can agonize over the right word or the right link from one paragraph to another. But it's that craft. So what you've seen here, Megan looked exactly what's in my year for a workshop, where she took the first version of the student's chapter with her comments on it, and second chapter, second version, to see what the student had done in that process. Because it's not, so supervisor's feedback is not simply about do this, it's what about this and what do you. So there's a thinking process, the process of simulation and the production of students.
Okay, so then while this is still fresh for us and we're halfway, or not even halfway, but we're midway through this section, we're having a conversation. We have a request that we'd like to propose. You can smile as well while I'm saying this. So basically, the concept of this workshop being, based on an introduction for a thesis, it's a great workshop to attend, especially for anyone that's doing any kind of thesis. The question that I would like to ask is, could we have workshops for lit reviews, methodologies, chapters, and conclusions to continue? And can we do this on a basis where it's continued with either or both of you, and that you can do a similar exercise to what you did with giving us something like this, and then we kind of, went into it, looked at it, and then gives us food for thought, because this is a great workshop for anybody who's wanting to reintroduce themselves, especially after a long break, myself. So yes, would you consider doing that for us? Thank you.
We have this is part of the workshop series.
Great.
So, but it's this is the only one on right.
Yeah, but like for writing specifically is the question.
Yeah.
Greg, you know that we're right on the, you know that this is on the money. You know that this is something that we need. All right. Look, that's fine. We'll get the university to fund it, but please, this is really good. Really, really big request. I know we're asking of your time and stuff, but really, really valuable and useful. Dennis.
Of those chapters, which you kind of, a workshop.
It's just a thesis. Yeah, broken up.
Which would be the most important, you think, after the introduction?
All of them.
Well,
But-
say we could only do 2 of these workshops in the rest of the year.
Really?
Well,
I would
I
think
don't know, we have to-
empirical chapter.
Like, if okay, we're talking introduction now. The only thing would be lit review, methodology, how to do a chapter, and then conclusion. That's 4 extra workshops that I'm asking here. You've already negotiated 2. We just need another 2 more. So, what do you reckon?
We'll think about it.
we'll think.
Oh, no. Okay, you've got till the end of this workshop to then give us some sort of a response, please, because this is really important for us.
Yeah.
And this is valuable.
Like, we had a discussion this morning about the power and authority of the academic. Completely subverted, completely unacceptable.
What do you mean? I think this is a democracy here. We're all in agreement that this needs to be done. Do you disagree? Do you feel as though we don't need this, or do you think we need this?
I don't personally, but I can see it would have been useful.
Yep.
I think that's useful.
It would have been useful back then. Okay. So
To be
this is a
honest,
need.
I actually think not so much to review, certainly not methodology chapter. The thing that most people struggle with is how to analyze. And so we actually have run workshops on how to analyze in the past. So not about writing a chapter, but how to analyze. Yeah,
Analyze data.
yeah, because that's actually really hard. Your empirical chapters don't get right until you work out how to analyze.
So that would be the 5th workshop for us. Got you.
There's lots of for the dissertation hall.
Yeah. No, like please consider this. And yeah, we'd love to hear back from you
Yeah.
with
okay,
feedback
so
and response.
It's good to have that feedback. And, we're not a teaching, so department, obviously.
Of
we're a
course.
research institute, so we're not kind of that set up to do, to teach, but we're really keen to design the workshop series that we have around what people need, you know, what people are interested in. So
I've got something as well that's just come up. So, like in job interviews and job applications, I've been asked what is your research plan?
Oh, yeah.
And so it would be, I mean, helpful for me to have more of an idea of how one goes about developing one and what should be in one. Like for people who are towards the end and then to be thinking about what research they're doing next.
your research plan.
What is your research plan? Is the question.
So, yeah, is that
At
more
the
of
end
a
of the PhD,
CSC
that's
kind
all.
No. This is for people going forward.
So
After the
At the end of the PhD,
In
it's a
the
different
next 5
question.
years, I want to achieve.
Yeah. I want, yeah.
So
But
first,
then-
first year will be 2 publications.
Yeah.
For peer review public.
Yeah, stuff
journals,
like
and
that.
then you aim for an AS and postdoc. And
Yeah.
then after that,
Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's something. But what? Yeah. What's reasonable in that? How detailed should they be? There seems to be an expectation of say very detailed stuff. This is the feedback.
Look, at the end of the day, you guys are the experts. We're seeking knowledge from the experts. So however you want to.
Facilitators of your intellectual growth.
Yes, but you're the experts in that. You're the experts in that. So all we're asking is just for your expertise and sharing that with us so that we can successfully finish our thesis. Thank you.
That was right.
Yeah.
Yes.
10 minutes.
Come back to us at the end of the
Okay,
session.
yes.
Great.
I'll, yeah, it could be.
Yeah. There.
Okay. So, yeah, I knew this. And so I'm actually to the, sorry. Okay, I've also got some copies of this because I've had experience with PowerPoints in this room before. That hadn't been.
Thank you.
Yeah. Greg has
Yeah, we'll move on more. Other comments?
I thought you said, yeah, thank you.
right. Okay. So Greg has covered a few of the points I want to cover, or he's touched upon various of them. That's fine. And we'll elaborate on some of that. So I wanted to start with narratives and narrative items. Particularly in the context of writing personal or semi-personal narratives for your introduction. So, you may want to, in the introduction, to write a narrative of, which is a personal account of aspects of your thesis. And I'm particularly thinking about the fieldwork sort of context of your thesis, which is something which happens in time and place. And it had, obviously, it has duration. So, it might take place over a period of 6 months. Whatever those somewhere. It may be a series of, let's say, weeks that you spend in a place, and the place might be an institution, for example, that you are studying. So the fieldwork has duration, which lends itself to writing a narrative of it. So, so what you would be doing there would be taking the reader, taking the examiner into that fieldwork experience So one aspect of that might be that in the introduction, you say you might want to describe the trajectory that took you into writing the thesis. So that might include your own academic background. It might, for example, include a master's thesis, master's research that produced an issue or a problem, a question that you decided to address in a PhD. So, the question of where the idea for the research came from, it might come out of at least partly out of your personal circumstances. And Alex Coleman, in their introduction, she talks about her family and her family's ambitions for their children, which, sets the scene for the thesis, but it also takes you into her family and creates a kind of a narrative, because she starts with her parents and what they wanted. And then you have further down the track, you have Alex, who's reflecting back on her parents. Her parents probably never imagined that she was doing that, that they were sending her to university, so she ended up writing about her parents. But, clearly it works. It might, the thesis might have also come out of your own personal beliefs, your political beliefs, for example. You might be an activist in something like human rights arena. And that background has brought you to this particular topic that you're addressing. For some of our PhD candidates who are, who are working and doing a PhD part-time, it's partly related to something that encountered in the workplace, in their professional lives, and they've decided to go to a university to have the opportunity to, in a sense, step back from that professional engagement. And all of this is interesting background to have in an introduction, and it explains to the reader sort of how you got here in the first place. I want to emphasize, that there are many ways of doing all of this, and as Fred has pointed out, there's no one way of doing this. And Alex's introduction, as Greg has sort of pointed out, is a very particular way of writing an introduction, and it works in its own terms, and that's what it all comes down to. If you have this kind of narrative that I'm talking about in the introduction, it has to work. You can't just borrow somebody else's style of doing this. So moving on. Right. I want us to sort of think a bit about the way research evolves at time, which is, it's something that does happen, obviously, and we involve personal intercourse doing it. Nobody does a PhD and comes out the end of it the same person they were when they started. It's a life transforming experience. But as you, particularly perhaps on the early stages of the research, what you're actually encountering in the field, or even as you work through the literature in your reading, is you're developing your thinking as you're doing that, and things that sometimes occur in the field, in fieldwork contexts, are often sort of lightning bolt sort of experiences where something happens, you observe something, and your eyes are open to a whole sort of dimension of the topic that you hadn't kind of been aware of before. So, try that may change the aims of the thesis, not entirely, but it may change what you set out in your COC document, for example. And you have the flexibility to change to a certain point. That's what I'm talking about, the early sort of stages of the research. Just points at which you've gathered your data, and you can't change that. You can't sort of go back, gather a whole new art. But you may change the way you're interpreting the data. But just thinking about that early stage, so fieldwork's a transformative process, and probably most of what I'm talking here is from a sort of in context of anthropology and ethnography, that kind of fieldwork. But it wouldn't, in different disciplinary settings, I don't think would be that. COVID itself, you're the generation of COVID. In an academic sense, you're the ones who did your fieldwork during COVID, for instance. Yeah, and people, will be interesting to. It'll be interesting for people to be able to look back on that in time. But clearly, that may have had a major influence, depending when you started. Actually, it may have a major influence. You may want to talk about that, write about that in the thesis, and expand, how that changed things, if it did change things. Barbara, I think, I know in your case, the pandemic broke out when you were either in the field in India, in the village that we were working in, or were about to go there, and it completely turned everything upside down for you. So, I can imagine that you, for example, might want to explain that in the introduction, and how that affected your approach, or how that changed your approach, how you accommodated that, how you worked around that kind of, and you could do that writing a purely objective third person sort of account, or you might want to do it in terms of how it actually played out when you're in the field, how in a first person, right? But all of you had different experiences in your own individual research. You could, without explaining this kind of thing to the reader, it could end up being difficult for them to understand how you ended up with the thesis that you did. Why, for example, you chose this case study and not another one, which might seem more, the alternative one might seem more obvious to them. But it may very well sort of be that COVID constrained your choice, or that you may, as with my fieldwork, you may have started doing the fieldwork, gathering data in one place, which for me was vanilla. And after about after 2 months, I dropped vanilla and went to start all over again. It just became the reason I went into here. It just became possible to do the research that I wanted to do in the Philippines at that moment in time.
Seeing a theme here with
So
I'm seeing a theme here with the whole Thailand, Philippines, Bali. There's a theme going on.
well, it's all Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
But the without going into any detail, I was hosted by the National Museum in Manila, and this was sort of coming out of the Marcos years. There was no money, and everything was quite chaotic. And the topic that I wanted to research was about how the museum was attempting to put together a representative sample of the archaeology of the Philippines. It turned out they weren't in a position to do that because the only game in town, as far as the Philippines was concerned at that time, was the looting of archaeological sites. So people digging these archaeological sites up all over the Philippines, and people who work in the archaeologists had their hands full just trying to control stuff was actually disappearing out of the military itself as well. And anyway, so I decided at a certain point to change tack. That's a pretty dramatic sort of change. I don't think any of you have experienced that, but just going back to that point about the way things evolve and the options that you have for describing that evolution in the context of an introduction. You might have noticed too that I circulated a paper that Heather handed out about how the museum. No, I probably should send it to well.
Yes, we see it.
It's a paper by an English about the kind of traumas that a surprising number of PhD candidates in anthropology doing have actually experienced. So partly you read that. Did that
I glimpsed, yeah,
She narrated some of it as well.
yeah. I mean, I could relate to a lot of it because I think like it's mainly talking about the kind of emotions mostly that we don't talk about, that happens in the field and when you're there for a long period of time, or when you're like feeling all kinds of things and not able to sort of bring it back to your writing experience. So it was interesting to read, and like even just the titles I was reading out.
That was the very important parts. Just the words that were coming through in the abstract were enough to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like we all sort of go through these, but we don't feel the need to communicate that this happens in the field also, that you want to always tell a success story and always portray it as, oh, how fun it was, or, you know, like, this is what I achieved in the field, and this happened in that. But you're also depressed, you're also paranoid, you're also pressured, you're also alone. So I think all of that, and basically, like, COVID was of course one of the major reasons that, like you were saying, that the field work was very disruptive and it did not go like I had planned. So there were a lot of moments of feeling disappointed, feeling like I was not managing to do enough and stuff like that. So when you read something like this, you realize that it happens with people at large. Like, it's not just that you're struggling as a person in the field alone. So yeah, it was pretty interesting.
And often what happens in either, you know, a PhD or academic work more generally is that we tidy up things so that, you know, the account that ends up in the thesis or a book so doesn't include all of that stuff. It's like, you know, well, there it is, this is perfectly straightforward.
Yeah.
I had these questions, I went to this place, I got this down. I would interpret it this way and there are the results. Yeah. Whether you choose to write in the first person, or the third person, whether you choose to write in the first person or more objective manner, it's entirely up to you. But you know, it is a different style of writing. And you may simply find, you know, try writing in a first person style and it just doesn't work for you, whatever it is. So, you know, don't do it. It's just an option that's there. Alex, in her introduction, is in the first person from what I can see, you know, almost half the time. But it's very fluid and it moves between first person and first and third person sort of writing, completely fluid. You know, she just moves from one to another. But what people often do is have a vignette, you know, it's sort of a paragraph, which is like a breakout, which is in the first person. And the rest of it, of the main text of the thesis, is not. So, you know, that makes the distinction sort of very clear, which, you know, you might actually put it in a box, or it might be indented, or you might have it in italics, something like that to make it clear that you're sort of doing it. Or you might simply, as Alex has done, weave it into the main text, so kind of integrate it. First person narrative can certainly, you know, be very effective in taking the reader into the place of research and the circumstances of the research, and that can be you know, important to their understanding of the thesis of the whole, and the, you know, the data they've been able to gather and reach. As you probably know, in the not too distant past, the first person writing in academia was frowned upon, was considered not to be legitimate, or it was often considered to be indulgent almost a sort of self-centered kind of
Narcissistic.
thing. And people might say, well, why do they think we want to know about them? I just want to know about this sort of topic. And often, you know, journal reviewers would object to the use of the word art. So anyway, that's part of the history of that. And there are still, you know, some people who either would object to first person writing, or would simply not want to write that way themselves. So again, you know, there are options that you have. And what really counts is whether it works or not. Right. Okay, so I've included the first part of the first paragraph of Alice's introduction, where she so she just begins the first two words of the thesis are my parents. It's immediately personal. It's immediately about her and the parents. So, you know, the word my is one of those person words that some people object to. But the other thing about what she's done, and I think Greg alluded to this, is that she jumps straight in. Right, she doesn't, there's no preface to this, she just jumps straight into this. My parents, like most, one of us is a good vibe. It may not be how the reader or the examiner expects a thesis to begin, but it's compelling, and you are, if you're writing something like that, you're kind of asking the reader to bear with you. You know, the average sort of reasonably intelligent person will know what you're doing. So she does that, and as Greg says, she partly writes this first person account, but then she moves out of that personal sort of account of her family into the intellectual sort of implications of that. So she almost immediately starts citing literature around this kind of area. And it's done, you know, perfectly sort of smoothly. There's no, it doesn't jar. And
Also, sorry,
yeah.
like even in the first sentence, there's this attempt to talk also about the most. So it is my parents, but it also says like most, and it changes the whole tone of that sentence, right? Because otherwise it's my parents wanted my sisters and me to have a good life. That's one way of introducing yourself and positioning yourself, but it changes the tone entirely when you say my parents, like most, wanted my sister. So there's also this good balance of the I with and in relation to the others. And
it's immediately generalizing to some much bigger picture,
right.
Which is, you know, bringing the reader
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah. So I'm writing about myself, but I'm also like others, and my experiences are all, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and you kind of have a sense that when she says, you know, like others, that there's more to come.
Yeah.
As you were saying, that she foreshadows things a lot. So, I wanted to go back a little bit to the 1980s and 90s is in anthropology, when there was sort of a revolutionary discussion about how to write ethnographies. And Clifford Geertz was one of the main players in this, very senior American anthropologist. And what Geertz was saying was that what he called the conventional way of writing ethnography, he describes it as author evacuation. It's a style of writing where the author is sort of taken out of the account as a person. And he's saying that we need to put the author back into ethnography because it, in his terms, it would be meaningless if you pretend that you're not actually there and your own feelings and emotions and material interests are not affecting what you're seeing and what you're not seeing. And so he, he's saying we have to take up the burden of authorship, by which he means that the author has a relationship to the text, which can't be avoided. It wasn't written by a machine; it was written by a living, sort of breathing person. Which goes back to this issue of situatedness in writing. I'm being transparent about the author's point of view, and I'm, give the example here from the perspective of a white Western male researching the rights of Filipino males in Hong Kong. There's no reason at all why a white Western male wouldn't or shouldn't be doing that, but it makes a difference. And we all, have a personal background, personal perspective.
Just wondering if this was like before, like the whole idea of situatedness, I'm assuming, is taken from feminist epistemologies and methodologies that were already arguing for that kind of break away from positivist writing and thinking. So was this in anthropology happening at the same time? Are there credits or references?
I can't really speak to how they form this work, but it's kind of pretty obvious that
Being informed.
it's in there, and there are plenty of people, women at that time, in it.
Yeah.
So one of the sort of more famous texts, books around the stuff, probably the most famous is this volume by Clifford and Marcus, called Writing Culture, which, if you're interested in this stuff, it'll probably be interesting to go back and look at that. It's an edited volume. So what the people who are involved in this, revolution, writing, were we're insisting on was that this kind of writing is a literary creation, that you shouldn't pretend that we're not creating literature. We shouldn't pretend that literature in that sense is novels. The difference in the old way of thinking was that fiction, or, the writing of literature, novels, poetry, and so on, was all based on the imagination, imaginary characters, imaginary places. Whereas academic writing was the writing of the world as it actually is. And what we obviously, understand is that we are writing about the real world, and we're trying to get as close to reality as we can. And in our writing, the creative sort of aspect of it is to do with getting us close to representing reality as we possibly can. And if we're not, interested in representing social, political, or environmental reality, we're in the wrong job. Basically, that's what we do. But the point I'm making is that there are many different ways of representing that sort of reality, and very often first person writing, to my mind, gets closer to it than an objective sort of style. But I've also emphasized that in one piece of writing, as Alex Coleman did, you can move between those modes. You can use it where it's most effective and then pull back and cover it in a different way where that is going to be most effective. We dropped down.
It's restarted because I get snooze, but
So yeah. So go to slide 7. I've pulled out a part of that book, Writing Culture. I'm not going to go into this too much, but about talking about ethnographies as fictions, and if you want to go back to that book, then that may be of interest to you. But just moving on to slide 8, this is James Scott's book, Weapons of the Weak, which is 1985. I think that's based on his PhD. Yeah, so it's in Peninsula Malaysia, a village there, and so this is the the first page of the opening chapter. So he's doing something a little bit similar to what Alex is doing. He's taking the reader directly into this village without any introduction. Like, these are the first words of the chapter. He doesn't say, in the following, I'm going to try to recreate the atmosphere of this village at a particular time. He just sort of takes you straight there. And right, so what he's actually writing about, social inequality and hierarchy, social hierarchy in this village and in this society. And he's decided to do it partly in the context of a narrative about what happened on a particular day. So he's writing in past tense. And we're kind of left to assume, I think, that this is coming out of the field journal, or at least it's based to some extent on a field journal. Otherwise, you know, how could there be this much sort of detail about what happened on that particular day? So jumping on, to slide 9. Again, from Alex's thesis, she was talking about her dad, better welder in this workshop. And she sees the manila folders on the shelf. Again, she takes the reader straight into that scene. She doesn't preface this by telling the reader what she's going to do in this situation. So there's an assumption the reader will be able to follow it. But you notice in her introduction, in those first pages, that she immediately follows up the first person bits, and here there are only, you know, like a sentence or two. She immediately puts them in the context of the thesis. So you might, in the first few instances, in the first few seconds, wonder why is she talking about her dad here? But she doesn't leave you wondering about that for like a whole page. Why am I reading this? She quickly told you why she's doing it. So, you know, obviously, this is a really key thing about writing a thesis or writing anything. If it comes down to that, is that you have to keep the reader with you. Right? You have to. They need to know what you're doing. And some things that you're doing may not be, they may not know why you're doing this, why you're writing, why you're telling them this. But pretty, you know, within a few sentences, you are going to explain why you're doing it. So readers can handle that to a certain point, but you have to be careful about, you know, like taking off on a particular tangent, which may be kind of interesting, but the reader is sort of left wondering, how does this relate back to the previous paragraph? You know, I need to know that. So you do need to, you know, bring them into the picture. Otherwise, you're going to lose their attention, which is the whole sort of purpose of any kind of writing. So in slide 10, from the same book, a different chapter, with I think it's actually the same chapter. The bit that I'm highlighting there, as we mounted the ladder into Hanzo's house, I realized, so what he's doing there is he's describing what they're actually doing in the field for this ladder, and then he pulls back to tell you what's going on in his mind. Okay, so and I noticed Alex sort of in a number of places she one place in particular she
This one with Jacqueline. where she's talking to.
Yeah, that's right. And
Yeah,
that's right. She's comparing herself to the participants, which is quite an unusual thing to do, I think, in a way. But you know, she gets away with it.
Yeah.
And yeah, then she talks. It's almost like she's taking you into the room where the interview is going on. You know, she says something like, Jacqueline wasn't sure how I was going to react, so you know she's projecting onto Jacqueline. But it creates a kind of an immediacy, which I mean I find really compelling. And again, she does it in a way that that works. And I highlighted the word visiting further down that page with Scott driving about this incident. He steps out of the narrative to make a statement. Visiting, except between equals, was always done up the status ladder of the village. So he's making this general observation. He's stepping back from the immediate sort of context of being in the village, going up this ladder, back to give you this general statement. And then later on, he goes back into the narrative. So I'm going to talk about the vignette now, and I'm using an example that Vanessa kindly sent me from one of the draft chapters. So, and I should say that Vanessa has a number of vignettes in her chapters, which I think all of them relate to her fieldwork. And in this case, she's taking the reader into the field with her. And the way she's actually done this on the page is that the vignette is in a kind of a box alongside the main text. So it sits there to one side. And so there is a sense in which it's a parallel to the main text. And it has that quality that I mentioned before, that the distinction between it and the main text is very apparent to the visual. That's one way of doing it. So I might want to read that, just read through. And I'll, so that's most of it up there again. And the points I want to make, and Vanessa might have to sort of elaborate or comment on my comments. You know, clearly what she's doing is taking the reader into both the geographical setting of the research and into the circumstances of the future. And one of the circumstances is that she is in an area which is a national park where there are park rangers who are employed to manage the park. And then there's the community who, while they are traditional owners, they're a native title over the land and not are somewhat distinct from the managers. And she finds herself in a situation where she has to lock the car, and the act of locking it.
Jump in.
Yeah.
Essentially, all the houses in Rangerville were So
Are there in a compound?
they're surrounded by cyclofencing. So and so your house and yard that's surrounded by cyclofencing, and you drive the car in and you padlock the gate. So
Yeah,
it's
to stop people.
to stop people stealing.
Yeah, yeah, which,
Well, yeah, so I was told to make sure you drive the car, make sure you,
yeah,
because we've had some crime in the community.
and you say that, you experienced a moment of shame that, at, doing.
Actually, Baltimore.
Yeah.
People were waiting at me, and I'm also waiting myself. No.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of relate to that because in working with an Aboriginal community on the north coast of New South Wales, the first time I was in the field there, I'd gone out with two Aboriginal women, and when we came back to the the reserve, the Aboriginal reserve, where was some living. And we got out of the car to go into the community office. I immediately, this was a government car. I immediately sort of thought, I'm not going to lock the car because the whole symbolism of it, who am I locking this against? So I walked away from the car, and one of the women turned around and said, "Lock that." Like so I locked it. So they didn't want the kids sort of filtering anything out of the car, and they just didn't want that sort of trouble. But it was much easier for them to say that. But something like this happening when you're in the field work sort of context, really, I imagine, threw you back on question like who am I with? Am I with the managers?
Yeah, I do have this in the introduction, but I moved this in-depth into the affectivities chapter. So a chapter where I talk about affective
Right.
the settlers, the way settlers express their emotions about the city and this as well. So I've moved this now into where I talk about settlers talking about shame. So I've got them talking about shame, and I've got my other shame style being moved. So you could sort of put them in various places. I mean, it would sort of go in the beginning because it's about moving and starting, going into town, what starting my first impressions. So you could sort of put them in a range of places. So,
why did you decide to do it in this form rather than just?
I don't know. But that's not but, sorry, it's from a field journal.
Yeah.
So I wrote.
You decided to use field journal rather than.
I decided that this is was my autobiography. So the way I've done autobiography. So it's not so much because I reflected on the day, I reflected on also things that happened. So I tended to write that up. Yeah. And some things I've just kept as memories, or some things that happened I didn't write to afterwards, but I might remember things that happened.
Yeah.
And just but it just.
And you actually had it. You were maintaining it.
I was, but some things I didn't write down. I kept as memories, and I've written later straight into the chapter.
Yeah. Right.
As the little boxes. Yeah. Cool.
This involves, this kind of thing, and these first persons sort of come to feel that end up in thesis and books. Obviously, and this goes back to the point about literary creation. There's a process of filtering and translating that goes on, and clearly, in Scott's case, the book, he's probably writing the book, 5 years or something, 3 years, whatever, after he was in this village. And, we can assume it's sort of based on a journal entry, but it's far too composed, the narrative, it's far too sort of composed in my mind to have been taken straight out of the journal entry. So he's reconstructed retrospectively. And, that's okay. Moving on to sort of towards the now, and I'll come back to the issue of journal here. This is Vanica's we've met in one of the chapters where she's talking about this is the left here in italics. And that's the main part of the text that follows on this page. So she's writing about being going into a particular square in the village, and what she's it's early in the morning. Her work is sweeping up house and so on. I make my way down the square to other parts of the city. The sounds of sawing, drilling, cutting, filling air, clouds of dust, and groups of laborers and material are a constant reminder of the city being reconstructed. So she's taking the reader into the field setting in a very immediate kind of way, and she's using this device of giving the actual day. That can be sometimes occurs in a situation where you give the hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 8 or whatever it is. Humans seem to be very susceptible to this. The dates, we put a lot of weight on that, and it has the effect of conveying a sense of real immediacy, but also in a way of conveying a certain veracity, a certain sort of factualness. This didn't happen just any time, it happened in this moment. So Vanica, the whole thesis is about post-earth phase reconstruction of heritage sites in Nepal. It's very much about materials and places, and she wants the reader to kind of inhabit the place as far as possible, so to be able to sort of imagine what it looks like, what it feels like to be there. As part of the reader understanding what heritage conservators and so on are actually doing to the story. So just a few words about field journalism. If you're using a field journal, and not everyone is in a kind of position to do that, and the kind of pressure that you're under time-wise these days, in the amount of time you can spend in the field, may make it possible to do that. So, there may be alternative ways to avoid what is happening. You might be sort of sticking into your phone, or walking around, for example, or taking a lot of photographs that are going to trigger your memories later on. But certainly in the case of field journal, they not only serve as a way of capturing data, so you're writing down observations, you're writing down what somebody said, often based on little notebooks that you actually have when you're walking around or talking to people, jotting down single words or something like that. So it's a bit like this one from Michael Tarsik's book, which is called I Swear I Saw This. So with something like that, you'll assume that he'd sit down at the end of the day and write up his journal on the basis of that. So there's, as well as capturing facts, data, the fact of sort of writing it down almost always means that you're sort of writing about not just what you saw, but what you think about what you saw. So you're already interpreting the data. And as you go on, sort of day by day, your thinking, your interpretation is sort of evolving. And that the writing of it is somehow, you know, almost magically sort of part of that evolution, the writing of it down sort of helps do that. And there's an iterative element to it as well. So, you know, what happens, you start with scraps of paper that turn into journal pages, and the journal pages end up sort of turning into parts of your thesis. And then you go on to write a book based on the thesis. And you know, there are transformations and translation sort of going on between those iterations. As a, you know, I was giving the example of Scott writing so many years later. He's, you know, he's creating something that works on the page, but may not be quite what he had in his journal. So I'm sort of thinking how important photographs in the field from the field work can be in terms of Driscoll. You know what these photos are. They're from a house in Georgetown County, which is near Hong Kong. It's in that time, from which a lot of people migrated to Australia in the second half of the 19th century, first part of the 20th century. Many of them sent money back from Australia to build houses, which are still in these photographs. Some of them are quite grand structures, and some of them are now abandoned. And this is the upper floor of one of these houses. Like, you know, somebody just sort of walked out of there 10, you know, or 15 years earlier. And that's a view into this room and looking down on their photograph snapshots. So lines that start with kitchen utensils and things like that. The point I'm making is that you can almost write a chapter from that photograph. There's so much detail in it, you know. So as you're walking around and sort of taking photographs, which it can be a really good source for writing a first person account of what it was like to be there. Which, you know, Vatican may have been doing that, right, about that square. You know, she looked at the photograph, she said, okay, this is here, that's there. Like, and I remember now walking through the place. And just to conclude then, I thought I'd mention a few books around this kind of thing that, you know, if you're interested, I would look at. On the right is reflections on fieldwork in Morocco, which has been an influence on many of us. What that is Paul Roland's book that came out after he wrote his PhD, which is, he goes, in this book, he writes about doing fieldwork, what it was like in the field. And it's almost a sort of a different account of the same thing that is in the thesis, except it's personalized. And it's fabulously well written. And then so that came out in the 1980s, I think. And then Anna Steen's book, in the realm of the Down Queen, which is set in Borneo, Indonesian Borneo. And that came out in the 2010, I think. But again, that's based on a PhD, but it's a completely different style of account to what would be PhD thesis. And then there are a couple of more recent books about writing. So in that there, and we've got, how long have we got? We've got 13 minutes. Right. So anything you'd like to say about, obviously, about the first part of the workshop or this part.
Very informative, both of them, and how you both addressed Alex's thesis in terms of structure, and then going through the logics and all of that, and maneuvers, understanding that, to then looking at how it was personalized with the Vietnam. How do you say it?
Vignette.
Vignettes.
Vignette.
Yeah,
Vignette.
vignettes.
There's a
That's
wide,
right. Huh?
there's a wide.
There's a
Yeah, vignette. Yeah, that. And just kind of tying it all in to kind of demonstrate that, an introduction, it can be flexible while staying in its, in the parameters required. But it's also nice that you can add a little bit of creativity. Right. And yeah, I found it really good, as you know, which is why I want more workshops. Yeah, thank you.
No, I think, one of the points you made before was that particularly later in the thing, it's really important that you look at this is can, and obviously really interested, but look at how people handle things, get a sense of the options that we have and what works for you best.
And what works on the page.
Yeah, but actually, I got that advice from Chris earlier as well.
Yeah.
So it sounds about right.
When you're reading earlier theses or books, some of these, and you see something that you really like the way, somebody's done something, and it really works. It's sometimes good to spend a bit of time trying to figure out why it works, how it works, even down to the level of, well, not even, but the punctuation
Yeah.
made for it. We don't often sort of give ourselves time to do that, to stop sort of thinking, how does this paragraph work? But really learn from it.
Yeah, I think it's like definitely very helpful because I've been the research work and the field that I've been part of, it's almost 8-9 years, and it's an extension of the master's work that I was doing. So one of the feedbacks that I've had from like my examiner is one of the very renowned feminists in India, and she enjoyed reading the thesis, but her only problem with my thesis was that there was like I was missing from the thesis because, and I think at that point I had made that conscious decision of hiding behind my participants because I was introduced to an indigenous community, and I wanted to keep the limelight to them, and it was always a struggle as to how you position yourself and you make space for the participants that you're also talking about. But now I think over the years, at least, this has become, I can see that I can justify it more as to why I need to position myself, why I need to place myself, also talk about myself as one of the people in the research, which has been hard, to be honest. But now I see it, and there's this, so there are some works that I'm reading, Nagar's work. She writes a lot about the ethics of negotiation, of co-authoring or storytelling or engaged action-based kind of research works, where she's talking about what is the importance of picking up encounters and writing from the position of being one among the co-researchers, but also how you're an outsider. So that tension, keeping that tension going, but also sort of situating. So this is helpful in the sense that it validates that kind of writing, that it's possible and you can find a balance. Yeah.
Have you got to the point of writing that?
Yeah, I am actually writing parts of like why, like you were just saying, that how your research starts making more sense. And I was telling Shapira this yesterday, that it's almost like after 8 years, I'm realizing why I was doing this research, why was it so personal for me, which has happened only in the last 2 years because of the COVID and going through your own process of, internal reflection sometimes, which you don't do when you're necessarily in the field and you're doing all kinds of things that you're required to do, so to say. So it's more reflective and it's more engaging now that I'm trying to write it in the PhD. And I think I want to sort of do it in this way of storytelling, which is why Richa Nagar becomes important, because she's basically arguing for storytelling as methodology, especially in this kind of activist, feminist, coming from these kinds of spaces where the ethical negotiation that you make with people you're working with is that you're telling their stories. So that's what is the methodology around that. And so, yeah, I'm trying to write it in that way.
In the introduction.
I don't know where it will go as of now because I've just started.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, it might happen in the introduction, or if I have a separate methodology section, which might be needed. But I remember that in the MPhil thesis, actually, my introduction starts with a meeting that I was having with the women that I work with. And there's somebody's quote that I start with, and then that's how I introduce the group. And so that was one way of doing it. But again, it's more to write about the field and what's happening in the work.
Good question.
Right. What are your thoughts about the length of the introduction?
Mm.
Originally, I was advised to write a very short introduction, have more stuff in other sections of the thesis. Then, yeah.
Yeah, no, look, that's a good question. Actually. It's not just because of the boring kind of pragmatic one. So if you go back to other thesis, that's a fairly long introduction, and it's because methodology. So methodology, yeah, it's probably kind of as a reader, I like somebody to be able to tell me what's going on and say before that's the words 5 minutes. And that's a personal choice. But it's quite possible to have a long introduction and that doesn't feel long. It doesn't feel like too much at all. I did actually, the second person I ever supervised with PhD wrote an incredibly long introduction. Maybe not quite, maybe twice as long. It was just way too long. But she insisted and got through it. But then when it became a book, she changed her mind and went back to the short, punchy reduction and some material. So, the thing is, length of chapters, again, there's no formula. You know, you can say 12,000 is a good word length for a chapter, but it depends on what needs to be done and also how good a writer you are. So 15,000 words you feel right if you're a really good writer. 5,000 words you feel like hell.
Yeah.
So, but for introduction, personally, as I said, I reckon you do what you need to do 45,000 words.
What about Brian and Rose?
Well, let's see. So I used the formula that's 45,000 words.
Percentage.
You still have to write along the.
Like the 300.
I think about 1,500 words or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
About 60% episode.
Well, again, it depends on the disciplines. So the expectation for us in the humanities and social sciences generally would be like 80,000. And generally 80,000 up. But I have examined and supervised a couple of things that are shorter than that. I know somebody who wants to can really badly to write 75,000 words. So it's kind of bizarre. So almost in book, but also we've got
But I assign one last job. As you said, it's really, really information work, which consists of organized. And this person organized and for my Monday, it's concerned for protection. And authenticity and 50% conclusion. Then divided by. Is correct?
It's very algebraic, isn't it?
That's not popular.
If you're going to kind of continue the fiction, think about a couple of favourite novels. So I've got novels that are close to 1,000 pages long, which I love. And I've got novellas that are irritating up to 60 pages. So again, as I said, it's about what you need to do, the task you've got, whether you're right. So if it does look slightly odd, if you've got a 5,000 word chapter, and a 12,000 word chapter, and a 5,000 word chapter, and a 50, but really, if that's your biggest problem, then
I was going to ask you that. Do you think chapters should be approximately the same length?
I think it's something to aim for, but it's not a law.
But they could be within maybe 2,000 words for each other. Do you think that would be
I mean,
within a couple of
Yeah.
thousand, say 10 to
but it's not the most important thing. You know, it's not the most important thing. But we do get anxious about it. I mean,
Maybe publishers are more keen on having, you know, that because it sort of gives. But I guess the
I don't think
confusion-
it's the publishers. I think it's examiner. It's very important. Yeah, examiner. No. It really depends examiner. The truth examiner got a different idea, and then you'll be in trouble.
we just had a bizarre experience with a publisher. We wanted the titles of our chapters to be all of the same order.
Of the same
So-
what?
Order. So we had a couple of chapters that were a quote. There's something,
Yeah.
and then we had a chapter title that was just like 3 words. And the publisher said, no, we they wanted the titles to be kind of symmetrical.
Right. Bizarre. Yeah.
Just change the font. just give them that kind of symmetry. Wow, lucky you. Oh my God. Are you still publishing there? Did you do it? That's what I'm curious about.
And yeah, it wasn't hard to do. It was just, I just thought, really? That's what
Really?
I'm worried about?
I know, right?
So And then in a couple of the ones that we wanted to stay as they were, we insisted.
Okay.
But that publisher is the people, this publisher is publishing Alex's thesis. So we're actually quite happy with what we've got. But it's interesting how we're going to come down to things like Rudely. And what am I allowed to do? What can't I do? So we want rules.
Yeah, yeah. But I think if examiners are liking what they're reading, if they're impressed, by the arguments and kind of dark and stuff like that, but they're not going to sort of be too worried about, whether this chapter is too long.
Yeah.
That one, they'll allow you the freedom.
A good examiner is generous. So even if they don't like what you've done or don't agree with you, they will go with it.
Yep.
Okay. So if you got a response that says this chapter is too long, that's a meaningless response. Or I don't agree with the argument. The role of the examiner says whether the term that's been set, whether it meets its goals and it meets all kind of conventional as well. I've read many pieces that I think I disagree with quite strongly. When you write comments about whether the thesis meets the requirements of the thesis, then you write some comments about why they're wrong. And they don't necessarily have to be the same.
Yeah.
So how does the marking happen based on the former or the latter?
Well, for PhD, it's just pass fail or revise whether so that mark for it. So, and I've actually just examined a master research thesis from Sydney Uni, and they're pass fail as well. They don't get grades.
We get-
We
I think we do here, don't we? MRes?
have grades.
I don't know. Do we?
Yeah, our MRes, one foreign.
I'm going to Sydney, guys.
So the argument is that it had to be because it's part for an institutional process. You have to do a grade because then you can make an assessment on the basis of whether something.
Yes, I know.
So when I was on the committee 10 years ago talking about it, we were talking about it just as a pass fail, like a PhD. But the university wants to.
Oh, so you didn't influence that. Good. I still like you then.
It depends. So here at this university, we have 10.
Credits.
Other universities will have 3, some will have 4.
Real.
Of course, everyone living in opinion. To examine when he's going to each other, going to about the same paper. When they mark this paper, for okay, pass. Another examiner, no, so many problems. The which is a gap between 2 examiners is not very close. It's large gap.
Yeah.
What
So it's a problem with the MRes level when we look at numbers. PhD, it's not so much of a problem because we have an institutional process which adjudicates what needs to be done. So when those 2 responses come back in, the supervisors write a report which says these comments are ridiculous, these are really good, therefore we argue for this. And then that goes to a committee that says the supervisors made a good argument or a bad argument.